Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. My dear students, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. So this is part 3 of my video lecture on state territory. In part 2, I was discussing about the critical date. Critical date. The critical date is the date of the origin of the dispute, when the two rival states were making claims of sovereignty over the territory. So the most important thing is when proving the peaceful and continuous exercise of state sovereignty, that exercise of state sovereignty must be immediately before the critical date, not long time ago. It must be immediately before the critical date. A country must have evidence or proof that that state has exercised sovereign activities during that period, just before the dispute arose between the two competing states. Okay, so that's why in the third paragraph of the slide, it says that the state which can demonstrate an effective title in the period immediately preceding the critical date has the superior claim. So I will give one example about the critical date. The dispute between Malaysia and Singapore over Pulau Batu Putih. So it started with Malaysians' publication of a map in 1989. So the map was published in 1989, and then placing Batu Putih in the within the Malaysian state maritime territory, and later on Singapore protests against that, and Singapore argued that Batu Putih belongs to them. So that's when dispute arose in 1989. So that's why 1989 is the critical date for the dispute between Malaysia and Singapore. That's why both Malaysia and Singapore must give evidence of continuous and the peaceful sovereign activities, exercise of sovereign activities, just before the critical date. Between that, in the 1970, 80, something like that. Even though long time ago, 18th century, 17th century, some state has exercised sovereignty, this is not taken into consideration. Before the critical date, the period immediately preceding the critical date, during that period, the state must prove with evidence the exercise of sovereignty. And the court also will not accept the proof of or evidence of exercise of sovereign activities after the critical date. This critical date is the cutoff date. After the critical date, why after the critical date any evidence or proof is not accepted by the court? Why? Because there can be fake. States may make some, fake the activities, fake activities over the territory, showing that we are now exercising sovereignty. Now, this is not accepted. This is not accepted. The proof of sovereignty, exercise of sovereignty, must be before the critical date and not after the critical date. This is the most important thing. Okay, now, the next point is the concept of intertemporal law. The concept of intertemporal law. Normally, intertemporal law means the contemporary law. Something, some event, some fact should be determined according to the law which is contemporary to that event, that act, or that fact. The law which is contemporary. Okay, so that's why is an event occurred or a treaty concluded in 17th century. So that treaty has to be interpreted, or the act has to be examined on the basis of the international law which was accepted, which was existed at that time, but not the current, the modern international law. This is what we call intertemporal law. Okay, so this intertemporal law, the original concept of intertemporal law has been explained by Sir Gerald Fitzmaurice in this passage. The situation in question must be appraised and the treaty must be interpreted in the light of the rules of international law as they existed at the time. The rule of international as they existed at the time means the old international law. The international law which is contemporary to that situation or that treaty. And not as they exist today. Not as they exist today mean not international law which exists today or the current international law. So this concept is known as intertemporal law. Now, how we apply this intertemporal law to the territorial cases, territorial dispute cases. Now, this is the next slide is the application of intertemporal law by Judge Yuba in the Palmas Islands is the leading case of Palmas Islands. So, in this case, actually, I will explain to you very briefly about the facts of this case, Palmas Islands case. So, this Palmas Islands was actually one of the faraway islands, which is now consisted in the Philippines archipelago. It's a very far away islands. Only natives are there. A little bit number of natives are there. So there was a war between Spain and USA for the Philippines islands, and USA defeated Spanish army in the Philippines, and then they enter into a treaty of cession in 1898. Treaty of cession. Cession means transfer. So after the defeat, Spain transferred or ceded the Philippines island, including the island of Palmas, to America. So America was relying on this Spanish title, and then Spain argued that they discovered the island long time ago in the 16th century. They discovered these Palmas Islands, and America relied on Spanish discovery, and now later on Spain transfer their legal title to America by means of cession. So that's why this is the American claim. But on the other hand, the rival state is the Netherlands. The Netherlands argued that they have been exercising sovereignty over this Palmas Islands case since 18th century, 19th century, and up to the date 1890, up to the year 1898, Netherlands was exercising certain amount of sovereign activities over the Palmas Islands case. So that's why this is the facts of the case. So Judge Yuba stated the intertemporal law first, because Spain argued that they discovered the Palmas Islands. So that's why Judge Yuba said that the effect of discovery by Spain is therefore to be determined by the rules of international law in force in the 16th century, because this situation occurred in the 16th century. Whether it was lawful or not, we have to apply the law, international law, enforced in the 16th century. And I have already explained to you that in the past, in the 16th century, international law was very flexible, and even mere discovery may create inchoate title, So that's why Spain could rely on that, and they create inchoate title. They can create title to the Palmas Island case. But the second part of the discussion was that Judge Yuba had also to consider whether the Spanish sovereignty, the so-called Spanish sovereignty, happened to be started in the 16th century over the island, whether this sovereignty subsisted here means continue to exist up to the critical date in 1898. Because the dispute between America and Netherlands in this Palmas Island case arose in 1898 when the Treaty of Cession was adopted between Spain and America. So the Netherlands objected to that. We own the island. So that's why the dispute between America and USA occurred in 1898. So that's why the critical date is in 1898. So that's why Spain has to prove that their sovereignty still exists up to 1898, not in the 16th century only, up to the 1898. Immediately before 1898, Spain still have had sovereignty over the Palmas Island case. Okay, so that's why in the second part of this discussion, Judge Huber gave a new dimension to the intertemporal law. So I have already explained to you the original intertemporal law as stated by very famous judge and jurist Sir Gerald Fitzmaurice. And this original intertemporal law is very simple, right? A fact, a situation, an event has to be determined according to the law which is contemporary to that fact or that situation or that event. So meaning that the Spanish discovery was to be determined whether it's valid or not, to be determined according to the 16th century international law, not the current law. This is the original intertemporal law. But Judge Huber make an amendment to this original intertemporal law and give a new dimension to the intertemporal law. So according to Judge Huber, what is his new dimension? Or what is his amendment to the original intertemporal law? So according to Judge Huber, a distinction must be made between the creation of rights and the existence of rights. The creation of rights, the right when the right was created, and the existence of the rights mean whether this right still exists now in the modern time, in the current time. So this is the two point of time now: the creation of right and the continued existence of the right. So the creation of right, when the right was created, and whether the right still continuously exists in the modern, in the current time or not. And the continued manifestation, the continued existence of this right shall follow the condition required by the evolution of law. Evolution of law here means the current, the modern international law. The creation of the right, okay, the creation of the right could be decided by the old law, old international law, the law which exists at that time. But the continued existence of the right means whether this right is still valid now at the present time is to be decided according to the present law. The evolution of the law means the law will evolve, right? The modern, the current, the present international law to be applied in the current, modern international. This is the new version of intertemporal law as far as the territorial disputes are concerned. Okay. Okay, that's our next. The next slide is this is more explanation on this. That's why, as far as acquisition of territory is concerned, the acquisition of territory not only should be consistent with the international law in existence at the time when a particular act was done, alleged right arose. It must be consistent with the old international law. The law when the right was created at the time, what was the old international law? It must also be consistent with the old international law. But also that the continuing sovereignty, we have to prove that the sovereignty still continues. The continuous sovereignty should satisfy the requirements of the international law as developed in later periods until the critical date. What is international law at the time of the critical date? This is important. So the acquisition of territory or sovereignty must be in accordance with the old international law, and also the continued existence of this title to territory must also be in accordance with the current, the modern international law until which is existing at the time of the critical date. It's very clear that in 16th century, it is true that Spain could have inchoate title in the 16th century. But according to the facts of this Palmas Islands case, Spain failed to prove that it exercised sovereign activities immediately before 1898, that is critical date. And on the other hand, Netherlands was able to prove that they exercised sovereign activities in the 18th century and in the 19th century up to the critical date. That's why in the Palmas Islands case, the ICJ, sorry, not ICJ, the arbitral tribunal by Judge Huber decided that Netherlands own the Palmas Islands, not Spain, and then not America, which